So this morning we're piloting an idea that is family religious school Shabbat, where families come and study together, text, and learn together. And I'm so glad to have this incredible response by the religious school community. And now, as a community, we will all learn together exactly what the religious school families have been thinking about for the last hour. I was inspired by my experience learning at the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem, where we would spend 2 hours in the morning learning before we would go to class. And so you just sit down with your partner or partners, and you begin looking at texts without any kind of direction before you go to class, and then you hear the professor talk about what it all means. In theory, you've spent a couple hours mulling it over beforehand. So here we go. What do we have before us? We have before us a section from the Torah from this week, Lech-Lecha, that begins the narrative, that begins the story about Abraham and Sarah and their journey. And we read that God said to Abraham, "Go forth, Lech-Lecha, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I'll make you a great nation, and I'll bless you, and I'll make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those that curse you. And all the families of the earth will bless themselves by you or through you, however we understand it." Abraham took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and all their stuff. I talked about on Yom Kippur. They loved schlepping their stuff around. And all the people, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Does anybody have any questions about the text before I go on? Because this is going to be a interactive back and forth. Any questions? Daniel Leiner, who did an amazing job before. Yasher Koach, yes. Why did they decide to bring all their stuff with them? It is such a good question. And I would tell you that they really had a sense and an attachment to their stuff, and Blair would tell you that they made a mistake. They should have left their stuff and thrown it all out in Haran and traveled lightly. But Blair's smiling at me like it's enough. It's clear that the detail tells us that they have stuff, right? That Abraham and Sarai are not people without means. Everywhere they travel, we recall their cattle and their sheep, and they come out of Egypt, and this very week, they go to Egypt, they make a mistake, they come out of Egypt wealthier with even more stuff. More flocks, more herds, more everything. It's clear that all of the flaws that we see in Abraham's character, one of his flaws is not business, right? He seems to become wealthier at every stage with his steps and missteps. He continues to become wealthier and more successful over the course of his life, because we have to wonder to ourselves, why is it such a big deal which son gets the blessing at the end of Abram's life? I'll tell you who doesn't care which son gets the blessing is King David, right, of 8 children, whose father is not all that wealthy. When we're introduced to him, he never complains, or there's never a discussion between the children who gets the blessing. It's clear who gets the blessing, and in that blessing there isn't any stuff, right? So here there clearly is stuff, and that creates a certain tension from the very beginning of the text. And if you have any further questions, you can talk to Sandra Cass about trusts and estates, because I think that's where this conversation is going to go. Okay, great. So in between the Torah's text, the top text, if everybody's looking at the Torah text at the very top, and the text at the bottom from the Mishnah, we take an incredible leap. The leap isn't of time, and the leap is of authority. The Torah at the top in ancient Israel, who did it imagine to be in charge of Jewish ritual and Jewish observance? God is always in charge. Thank you, Diane. That was terrific. But who did it imagine as leading the Jewish people in terms of ritual? What were the rituals? The book of Vayikra, for example. Were there rabbis in the book of Vayikra? Thank you. There were priests, right? They're Kohanim. Kohanim and Levim, and the reason we know them is they still insist on taking the first and second Aliyah. I don't know everybody who is Israelite like myself, but at a certain point it becomes, enough is enough. So, but they still take the first and the second Aliyah, right? Because they were in charge. But something happens between the first text and the second text. There's a change of authority. The rabbis become in charge of Judaism, a group that it's clear did not exist in the Torah itself. The rabbis take hold of Judaism. And the rabbis reimagine this text. If we just read the top half and what God tells to Abram, don't we think that would be enough for us to bless ourselves through Abram? Of course it would. God clearly tells Abram, everyone will bless themselves through you. The rabbis come along and say, no, it's not enough, actually. We have to know that Abram was tried 10 times through tests, through trials, and he ended up successful in the end. There's a famous Torah commentator by the name of Mike Ditka. Mike Ditka said, it wouldn't be worth winning the Super Bowl unless the Bears beat the Packers twice in the season. As it turns out, the Bears beat every team that season except for the Miami Dolphins, 15-1, on their road to the Super Bowl. Why is it important for the rabbis to talk about Abraham's season record of 10-0, according to them? And I'm not sure it's 10-0. That's why there's constant discussion on which 10 trials he passed exactly over the course of his life. Why is it important for the rabbis to talk about Abraham's record? As a clue, it's going to turn right into the next page. We're going straight into the next text. Because it's not God's promise that makes us a family. God's promise alone is not enough to make us a family. Shared experience is what makes you a family. And we all know that intuitively. We know that when we sit down at Shabbat, none of us sit there talking only about the reason we're there is because we had wedding vows, because we made a promise. The promise alone is not enough. The moments at the vacation, the moments from the week, the silliness, the mishaps, the shared experience that we all laugh about, that's what makes us a family. And if we're going to transition Judaism from a time of commanded ancient Israel, of people walking cows and sheep up to an altar and burning them for the sake of God, which, by the way, must have tasted delicious. If we're going to transition from that Judaism to a Judaism of cholent, where we take that meat and put it in a pot and put it in the middle of the table and all gather around as a family, not as a temple, but as a family. If we're going to do that, then we're going to do that based on shared experience. We're going to daven as a family because we want to be together just as much as we're commanded. Because togetherness and community becomes as important as the fact that God gave us instructions at Sinai. And so when the rabbis revolutionized it, we turn to the page 2 of the document. We turn to page 2 of the document. I don't know how many people have ever spent time thinking about the beginning of the Shemona Esrei, the beginning of the Amidah. But we say to God, listen to our prayers because we're the children of these people. I know that I stand before you not as good as my parents' generation, who were not as good as my grandparents' generation, who were not as good as their parents' generation. But we go all the way back to people who we know that you loved. Those people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, that's our family. We don't stand before God and say, we made a deal with you at Sinai. That would be the approach of the Torah. The approach of the Torah is that we made a deal. Your turn to pay up. Health, happiness, wealth. It would be a much shorter prayer. Right? That's a contractual relationship. But it's interesting, it's an asymmetrical relationship. God expects from us our end of the contractual deal, and we expect from God because we are part of the family. God made a contract with people, and we are the children's children of those people. And it's because we know the journey of where our parents are from and grandparents are from and great-grandparents are from. It's because we know the trials and tribulations that they went through, the hardships, that qualifies us to stake a claim for their stuff. And in this case, that stuff is relationship with God, is relationship with each other, is relationship with Torah. We come together as a community today of all generations because what we do as the Jewish people is we try to encourage the next generation to stake that same exact claim. It was so important for us to claim that stuff. Now you go get it. Go get it in your own way. And so the Torah doesn't belong to one generation that stood at Sinai and subsequent generations don't get it. The covenant doesn't only belong to Abram and Sarai when God tells them to go get it. The land of Israel doesn't only belong to Joshua's generation who conquered it. The accomplishments of the Jewish people are passed down from generation to generation with only one expectation, and that expectation is that you also stake a claim in this wonderful, wonderful story. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
On page 430.
The Musaf Amidah begins on page 430, led by our religious school community.
First is knees, waist, and up. Here we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avoteinu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak ve'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel ve'Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor ve'Hanora El Elyon Gomer Chasadim Tovim Vekonei Hakol Vezocher Chasdei Avot Umevi Goel Livnei V'neihem Leman Shemo Be'ahava Melech Ozer Ufoked Umoshia Umagen. Here we go. Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham Ufoked Sarah